The black sedan pulled into the driveway just as the sun disappeared behind the trees. David Johnson sat behind the wheel for a moment, rubbing his tired eyes. It had been another long day at the office. 14 hours of meetings, briefings, and paperwork that seemed to never end. As the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, he carried the weight of national security on his shoulders every single day. David stepped out of his car and stretched his back. At 52 years old, these long days were getting harder to handle. His knees creaked as he walked toward his front door, briefcase in one hand and phone in the other. He was still thinking about tomorrow's early morning meeting with the Attorney General when he noticed something that made him pause. The porch light was out again. This was the third time this month. He made a mental note to ask his wife to pick up a new bulb when she went shopping. The darkness made it difficult to see the keyhole clearly. David fumbled around in his pockets, searching for his house keys, among the collection of office keys, car keys, and security cards that filled his jacket. The neighborhood was quiet except for the sound of a television coming from the house next door. David had lived on Elm Street for almost 8 years now. It was a peaceful suburban area in Virginia, about 30 minutes from downtown Washington. Most of his neighbors were friendly people, retired couples, young families, and working professionals like himself. Everyone pretty much kept to themselves, which was exactly how David liked it after dealing with chaos all day at work. Finally finding his keys, David approached the front door. The metal felt cold in his hands as he tried to insert the key into the lock. In the darkness, it was harder than usual. He had to feel around the door to find the right spot. The key went in halfway, then got stuck. David jiggled it gently, trying not to force it and break the key off in the lock. "Come on," he whispered to himself, tired and just wanting to get inside to see his family. Unknown to David, someone was watching him from across the street. Mrs. Patterson had moved into the neighborhood just 3 months ago. She was an elderly woman who had recently lost her husband and moved closer to her daughter's family. Being new to the area, she didn't know many of her neighbors yet. She spent most of her evenings sitting by her living room window, watching the quiet street and trying to feel connected to her new community. When she saw a figure moving around in the darkness at the house across the street, Mrs. Patterson became concerned. She couldn't see clearly in the dim light, but it looked like someone was trying to break into the Johnson house. She had met Mrs. Johnson briefly at the mailbox a few weeks ago, a lovely woman who worked as a doctor at the local hospital. Mrs. Patterson knew the family had 2 teenage children, but she had never actually met Mr. Johnson. From her window, all she could see was a tall figure in dark clothing moving around the front door. The person seemed to be struggling with something, possibly trying to force the door open. Mrs. Patterson's heart began to race. She had heard about break-ins happening in other neighborhoods, and the thought of crime coming to her new peaceful street frightened her. Meanwhile, David was still having trouble with his key. The lock had been acting up lately, and he made another mental note to call a locksmith this weekend. He tried turning the key the other way, then back again. Finally, he felt it catch and turn properly. The door opened with a soft click. "Thank goodness," David said quietly, pushing the door open and stepping into the warm light of his entryway. But Mrs. Patterson couldn't see that the door had opened normally. From her angle across the street, it looked like the person had successfully broken in. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone. She had programmed the local police number into her contacts when she first moved in, just in case something like this happened. The phone rang twice before a dispatcher answered. 911, what's your emergency? "I think someone is breaking into my neighbor's house," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice trembling with nervousness. "I'm watching from my window, and there's a man trying to get into the house across the street. I think he just got inside." The dispatcher remained calm and professional. "What's the address of the house being broken into?" Mrs. Patterson gave the address and continued. "It's a tall black man in dark clothing. I don't think he lives there. I've never seen him before, and I know the family has gone through some hard times lately. The woman who lives there is a doctor, and I think she's working late tonight." The dispatcher typed the information into the computer system. "Are you in a safe location right now?" "Yes, I'm in my own house across the street, but I'm worried about the family. They have children. We're sending officers to check it out right now." Please stay inside and keep your doors locked until the officers arrive." Mrs. Patterson hung up the phone and continued watching through her window. She could see lights turning on inside the Johnson house, which made her even more worried. Was the intruder going through their belongings? She hoped the police would arrive quickly. 2 patrol cars received the call. Officers Rodriguez and Thompson were the closest to the scene. They had been partners for almost 2 years and had responded to many similar calls in the area. Most of the time, these situations turned out to be misunderstandings, family members coming home late, house sitters, or maintenance workers. But they always took burglary calls seriously. "Possible break-in on Elm Street," Officer Rodriguez said to his partner as he turned on the emergency lights. "Caller says she saw a black male forcing entry into a residence." Officer Thompson nodded and reached for his radio to confirm they were responding. Both officers were experienced and professional, but like many police officers, they had developed certain assumptions about crime calls based on their years on the job. A break-in call in this neighborhood was unusual, but not unheard of. Inside his house, David had no idea that police were on their way. He set down his briefcase and loosened his tie. The familiar smell of his wife's cooking filled the air, something with garlic and herbs that made his stomach growl. He could hear his daughter practicing piano upstairs and his son talking on the phone in the kitchen. "Honey, I'm home," David called out as he hung his jacket in the closet. His wife Elena appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She was still wearing her scrubs from the hospital, having arrived home only an hour earlier. "How was your day?" she asked, giving him a quick kiss on the cheek. "Long, but it's over now," David replied. "What smells so good?" "I made that chicken dish you like. Dinner will be ready in about 10 minutes. David smiled for the first time all day. After dealing with national security issues, congressional briefings, and administrative headaches, coming home to his family was the best part of every day. He had worked hard to keep his home life separate from his demanding job, and moments like this reminded him why that balance was so important. Outside, the sound of approaching sirens was getting louder. Mrs. Patterson pressed her face closer to the living room window, her heart still pounding from making the 911 call. The street looked peaceful now, with warm lights glowing from several houses. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had definitely seen someone struggling with the front door of the house across the street, and now there were lights on inside that hadn't been on before. Being new to the neighborhood made everything feel uncertain. Back in her old town, she had known every neighbor for decades. She could tell you who belonged where just by looking at their silhouette from a distance. But here, everyone was still a stranger. The only person she had really met was the woman doctor who lived in that house. Dr. Johnson, she thought her name was. A very nice lady who had welcomed her to the neighborhood and even brought over some homemade cookies. During her first week, Mrs. Patterson tried to remember if Dr. Johnson had mentioned anything about her husband. She couldn't recall seeing a man coming or going from that house during the 3 months she had been watching the street. Of course, she wasn't always at her window, and people had different work schedules. Maybe the husband traveled for work or worked night shifts. There could be a perfectly innocent explanation for what she had witnessed. But doubt crept into her mind as she replayed the scene. The person had definitely been struggling with the door, moving in a way that suggested they were trying to force it open, rather than simply having trouble with a key. And in her experience, people who belonged somewhere didn't usually have that much trouble getting into their own homes. The sound of sirens in the distance made her feel both relieved and nervous. She hoped she had done the right thing by calling the police. What if she was wrong? What if she had just caused a huge misunderstanding for an innocent person? But what if she was right, and her call had prevented a serious crime? Officer Rodriguez was driving the patrol car, his partner Thompson riding shotgun as they navigated through the quiet suburban streets. Both men had been police officers for over 8 years, and they had responded to hundreds of burglary calls during their careers. Most of them turned out to be false alarms, worried neighbors who mistook homeowners for intruders, family members who had forgotten to mention they would be stopping by, or maintenance workers who had permission to be there. "What do you think about this one?" Officer Thompson asked as they turned onto Elm Street. "Could go either way," Rodriguez replied, slowing down as he looked for house numbers. "Nice neighborhood, though. Don't get many burglary calls out here." Thompson nodded, checking his equipment out of habit. His radio, flashlight, and other gear were all in their proper places. Caller sounded genuinely concerned. Elderly lady said she saw someone forcing entry. Well, we'll know soon enough, Rodriguez said, spotting the address they were looking for. Both officers had been trained to approach these situations with caution, but also with an open mind. They knew that assumptions could be dangerous both for their safety and for the people involved. At the same time, they had to take every call seriously and be prepared for any possibility. As they pulled up to the house, everything looked normal from the outside. The porch light was out, which made the front entrance darker than the rest of the well-lit street. There was a black sedan in the driveway, and warm light was glowing from several windows inside the house. It looked like a typical evening in a typical suburban home. Officer Rodriguez parked the patrol car on the street and both men stepped out. They could see Mrs. Patterson watching from her window across the street, and Rodriguez gave her a small wave to let her know they had arrived. The neighborhood was quiet except for the normal sounds of families settling in for the evening, televisions playing, children talking, the distant hum of air conditioning units. "Let's go talk to whoever's inside," Thompson said quietly. Inside the house, David was washing his hands in the kitchen sink when he heard his son call out from the living room. "Dad, there's a police car outside." David dried his hands and walked to the front window, pulling back the curtain slightly to look out. Sure enough, 2 police officers were walking up his front walkway. His first thought was that something might have happened to one of his neighbors. As the FBI director, he was used to law enforcement officers contacting him, but usually through official channels at his office, not by showing up at his home. "I wonder what they want," his wife Elena said, joining him at the window. "Probably checking on something in the neighborhood," David replied. "I'll go see what's going on." He opened the front door before the officers had a chance to knock. The 2 men were young, probably in their early 30s, and they looked professional and alert. David noticed that they both had their hands resting near their weapons, which was standard procedure for unknown situations. "Good evening, officers," David said politely. "Is everything all right?" Officer Rodriguez stepped forward. "Good evening, sir. We received a call about a possible break-in at this address. We just need to check it out and make sure everything is okay." David was confused for a moment. "A break-in here?" "Yes, sir," Thompson added. "A neighbor called and said she saw someone trying to force entry into this house about 15 minutes ago." Understanding began to dawn on David's face. "Oh, I think I know what happened. I had trouble with my key when I came home from work. The lock has been acting up lately, and it was dark because the porch light is burned out. I probably looked like I was struggling to get in." The 2 officers exchanged glances. This was exactly the kind of misunderstanding they encountered frequently. Homeowners having trouble with locks, concerned neighbors who couldn't see clearly in the dark, and 911 calls that brought police to investigate perfectly innocent situations. "That makes sense," Rodriguez said. "Do you have some identification we can check just to verify that you live here?" "Of course," David said, reaching into his back pocket for his wallet. As he pulled out his identification, David was thinking about how to handle this situation. His FBI credentials would immediately identify who he was, which might create an awkward situation for these local officers. On the other hand, his driver's license would confirm his address and resolve the misunderstanding quickly and simply. Behind him, his family was gathering in the entryway. Elna appeared with their teenage daughter Amy, who was curious about why police officers were at their door. Their son Michael had put down his phone and was listening from the kitchen doorway. "This is just a misunderstanding," David explained to his family. "A neighbor saw me having trouble with the key and thought someone was breaking in." Elena laughed softly. "That old lock really does need to be replaced." Officer Thompson was writing notes in his small notebook while Rodriguez examined David's driver's license. The address matched perfectly, and the photo was clearly the same person standing in front of them. This was definitely a case of mistaken identity. "Everything checks out, Mr. Johnson," Rodriguez said, handing back the license. "We're sorry to bother you at home. We have to follow up on all calls like this." "I completely understand," David replied. "You're just doing your job. I appreciate you taking the time to make sure the neighborhood is safe." The officers were preparing to leave when Mrs. Patterson appeared on her front porch across the street. She had been watching the entire interaction and was feeling embarrassed about the mistake she had made. Just as the situation seemed to be resolving peacefully, Everything changed in an instant. Officer Rodriguez's radio crackled to life with an urgent message from dispatch. All units be advised we have additional reports of suspicious activity in the same area. Caller now reports seeing the suspect inside the residence with what appears to be other individuals. Proceed with extreme caution. The atmosphere on the front porch shifted dramatically. Both officers immediately became more alert, their relaxed postures changing to high alert stances. Officer Thompson's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon while Rodriguez stepped back to create distance between himself and David. "Sir, I need you to step away from the door and put your hands where we can see them," Rodriguez said, his voice now carrying the authoritative tone of a police command, rather than the friendly conversation they had been having moments before. David was stunned by the sudden change. "Officers, I think there's been some kind of mistake. I just showed you my identification. This is my house. Step away from the door now," Thompson repeated more firmly. "We have reports of multiple people inside who may be in danger." Elena appeared behind David holding their daughter's hand. "What's going on?" she asked, seeing the tension that had suddenly filled the air. "Ma'am, please step outside with your hands visible," Rodriguez instructed. "We need to verify everyone's safety." David's law enforcement experience kicked in, and he realized the officers were following protocol for a potentially dangerous situation. Someone had apparently called in additional information that made this look like a hostage situation rather than a simple misunderstanding. He knew that the safest thing for everyone was to comply with the officer's instructions and sort out the confusion afterwards. "Elena, please do what they say," David said calmly. "There's been some kind of miscommunication, but we need to cooperate so they can figure out what's happening." But Elena was confused and frightened by the sudden change in the officer's behavior. Her husband had just shown them his identification, and now they were treating the family like criminals. "This is ridiculous," she said. "We live here. Our children are inside doing homework." Officer Thompson was now speaking into his radio, requesting backup and providing an update on the situation. "We have multiple individuals at the residence. Need additional units for support." The sound of sirens could be heard in the distance as more police cars began responding to the call. David's heart sank as he realized this simple misunderstanding was rapidly escalating into something much more serious. "Officers, I'm going to reach into my jacket to show you my work identification," David said slowly and clearly. "I'm a federal law enforcement officer, and I think this will help clear up the confusion." "Do not reach for anything," Rodriguez said sharply, his hand now resting on his weapon. "Keep your hands visible at all times." Mrs. Patterson was still watching from across the street, now joined by several other neighbors who had come out to see what was happening. The quiet suburban street was rapidly filling with flashing lights and the sound of approaching sirens. David found himself in an impossible situation. His FBI credentials would immediately resolve this misunderstanding, but the officers wouldn't let him reach for them. The additional 911 calls had changed their perception of the situation from a simple case of mistaken identity to a potentially dangerous scenario involving multiple people. "Sir, I need you and your family to exit the house completely and move away from the door," Thompson instructed. "Keep your hands visible and move slowly." Elena was becoming increasingly upset. "This is our home," she said, her voice rising with frustration. "Our children are inside. You're scaring them." Indeed, Amy and Michael could be seen watching from the living room window, their faces pressed against the glass with expressions of confusion and fear. They had never seen their parents in a situation like this, and the sight of police officers treating their family as potential criminals was terrifying. 2 more patrol cars arrived on the scene, their red and blue lights adding to the chaos on the previously peaceful street. 4 additional officers emerged from the vehicles, and David could see that the situation was now being treated as a serious incident rather than a routine call. Sergeant Williams, a veteran officer with 20 years of experience, approached to take command of the scene. He quickly assessed the situation and spoke briefly with Rodriguez and Thompson to understand what had developed. "We have a possible home invasion with hostages," Thompson explained quietly. "Multiple calls came in about suspicious activity, and we found these individuals inside the residence." Sergeant Williams looked at David and his family, trying to evaluate the situation. Something didn't feel right to him. The people on the porch looked like a typical suburban family, not like criminals or victims of a crime. But he also knew that appearances could be deceiving, and he had to prioritize everyone's safety. "Sir, I'm Sergeant Williams," he said to David. "We're going to need you and your family to cooperate fully while we sort this out. Can you tell me your name and what your relationship is to this residence?" "My name is David Johnson, and this is my wife Elena and our daughter Amy. We live here. This is our home." David's voice remained calm despite the surreal nature of the situation. "I believe there has been a serious misunderstanding. Mr. Johnson, we have reports that someone broke into this house and that there may be people inside in danger. We need to verify everyone's safety before we can resolve this." Elena stepped forward, her medical training helping her maintain composure even in this stressful situation. "Sergeant, I'm Dr. Johnson. I work at General Hospital. These officers can verify my identity and our address. Our son is still inside and he's probably terrified by all of this." The sergeant nodded and turned to his officers. "Rodriguez, what identification did you verify?" "Driver's license for David Johnson at this address," Rodriguez replied. Everything appeared to be in order, but then we got the additional calls about multiple suspects inside. Sergeant Williams was beginning to suspect that this was indeed a case of mistaken identity that had gotten out of control. The family's behavior and demeanor didn't match what he would expect from people involved in criminal activity. But he also knew he couldn't take any chances until he had verified everyone's safety. "Mr. Johnson, is there anyone else inside the house right now?" "Yes, our 16-year-old son, Michael. He's in the kitchen, probably wondering what's going on out here." The sergeant made a decision. "I'm going to have 2 officers escort you inside to verify that everyone is safe and that this is indeed your residence. Once we confirm that, we can clear up this misunderstanding." David nodded, relieved that the situation was finally moving toward resolution, but he was also acutely aware that his neighbors were watching. His children were frightened, and this incident would likely become neighborhood gossip for months to come. As Sergeant Williams prepared to escort the family inside to verify their identity and safety, his radio erupted with another urgent transmission. The dispatcher's voice was tense and professional, but the message sent a chill through everyone present. "All units on Elm Street, be advised we have received a third call from a different witness. Caller reports seeing weapons inside the residence and believes this may be an active hostage situation. Exercise extreme caution." The sergeant's expression hardened immediately. What had seemed like a case of mistaken identity was now being reported as an armed and dangerous situation. All protocols changed in an instant. The safety of the officers, the family, and the entire neighborhood was now at stake. "Everyone down on the ground now," Sergeant Williams shouted, drawing his weapon. "Hands behind your heads." David felt his world spin as he realized the situation had escalated far beyond anything he could have imagined. His law enforcement training told him that the officers were following proper procedure for what they believed was a dangerous armed situation. But his position as a father and homeowner made him desperate to protect his family. "Officers, please listen to me," David said, slowly raising his hands. "I am a federal agent. My credentials are in my jacket pocket. This is all a terrible misunderstanding." "Get down on the ground," Officer Thompson yelled, pointing his weapon at David. "Do not reach for anything." Elena was crying now, clutching their daughter Amy as both of them knelt on the cold concrete of their own front porch. Amy was sobbing with terror, unable to understand why police officers were pointing guns at her family. Through the front window they could see Michael still inside the house, his face pale with shock as he watched his family being treated like criminals. "This is insane," Elena said through her tears. "We live here. Check our mail, check our car registration, check anything you want. This is our home." David made a crucial decision that would change everything that followed. Despite the officer's commands not to move, he slowly began to reach into his jacket pocket. His FBI credentials would immediately resolve this situation, and he felt responsible for protecting his family from this nightmare. "Sir, stop moving," Rodriguez shouted. "I'm reaching for my federal identification," David said clearly and slowly. "I am Special Agent David Johnson, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." But Officer Thompson, pumped with adrenaline and convinced they were dealing with an armed suspect who might be reaching for a weapon, made a split-second decision. He holstered his gun and rushed forward with his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for resisting arrest and obstruction of justice," Thompson declared as he forced David to the ground face first on his own front porch. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut was like a gunshot in the quiet neighborhood. David's face was pressed against the cold concrete steps of his own home, while his wife and daughter watched in horror. Everything had gone completely wrong. "This is a mistake," David said, his voice muffled by his position on the ground. "Check my credentials. Call FBI headquarters. Call anyone." Elena was now screaming at the officers. "He's telling you the truth. He works for the government. This is our house." But her protests only seemed to make the situation worse as the officers interpreted her emotional response as evidence that something suspicious was happening. More backup units arrived, turning the quiet residential street into what looked like a crime scene from a television show. Neighbors had come out of their houses and were gathering across the street, pointing and whispering about the dramatic scene unfolding in front of the Johnson home. Sergeant Williams was trying to maintain control of the rapidly deteriorating situation. He ordered 2 officers to secure the perimeter, while others began to search David for weapons. They found his wallet, his cell phone, and his federal identification cards. Officer Rodriguez examined the FBI credentials with growing concern. The identification looked official and professional, but he had never seen FBI credentials before, and wasn't sure if they were authentic. The photograph clearly matched the man they had just arrested, and the name was consistent with everything else they had found. "Sergeant, you need to look at this," Rodriguez said quietly, handing over David's identification. Williams examined the credentials carefully. The seal looked authentic, the cardstock felt official, and all the information was consistent. But he was also aware that fake law enforcement credentials were not uncommon, and he couldn't take any chances. "Could be fake," Williams said, though his voice carried less certainty than before. "We'll have to verify this through proper channels." Meanwhile, Elena had managed to calm herself enough to think clearly. As a doctor, she was used to dealing with crisis situations, and she realized that emotional outbursts were not helping their situation. "Sergeant Williams," she said in her most professional voice, "I understand you're doing your job, but this has gone too far. My husband is exactly who he says he is. You can verify his identity with a simple phone call." "Ma'am, we'll verify everything at the station," Williams replied. "Right now, we need to ensure everyone's safety." David was loaded into the back of a patrol car, still handcuffed and still unable to believe what was happening to him. Through the car window, he could see his neighbors watching, his daughter crying, and his wife trying to hold their family together in the middle of what had become the worst night of their lives. Inside the house, Michael was still at the window, recording everything on his phone. At 16, he was old enough to understand that something terrible was happening to his family, but too young to know how to help. He had heard his father mention being the FBI director before, but it had always seemed like just another job. Now he was watching his father being arrested like a common criminal. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who had started this entire chain of events with her initial 911 call, was standing on her porch with her hands covering her mouth in horror. She had never intended for anything like this to happen. She had just wanted to protect her neighbors from what she thought was a break-in. As the patrol car with David inside pulled away from the curb, Elena ran after it, calling his name. But the car continued down the street, carrying her husband away from his own home in handcuffs. Officer Thompson was completing his paperwork when Sergeant Williams approached him with a concerned expression. "Thompson, I want you to call headquarters and have them run a full background check on this David Johnson character," Williams said. "Something about this whole situation doesn't feel right." "You think the credentials might be real?" Thompson asked. "I think we better find out for sure," Williams replied, "and we better find out fast." Back at the house, Elena was trying to comfort her children while also trying to figure out what to do next. Should she call a lawyer? Should she try to contact David's office? Should she go to the police station? The flashing lights were finally starting to fade as the additional patrol cars left the scene, but the damage was already done. The Johnson family's quiet evening at home had turned into a public spectacle that would haunt them for years to come. At the police station, David sat in the back of the patrol car in the parking lot, still handcuffed and trying to process what had just happened to him. Officer Thompson had driven him there while his partner Rodriguez followed in their original patrol car. The 20-minute ride had been conducted in complete silence, with David staring out the window at the familiar streets of his community. now seeing them from the perspective of someone under arrest. Thompson parked the car and sat for a moment, looking at David in the rearview mirror. Something about this entire situation was bothering him. In his 8 years as a police officer, he had arrested many people, but David Johnson didn't fit the profile of someone involved in criminal activity. His behavior had been calm and cooperative throughout the entire ordeal, even when the situation had escalated dramatically. "Sir, we're going to take you inside now to get this sorted out," Thompson said, the first words he had spoken since leaving the house. David nodded. "Officer, I understand you were doing your job tonight, but I need you to understand that this is going to become a very serious situation for everyone involved if my identity isn't verified quickly." Thompson felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in David's tone that suggested this wasn't a threat, but rather a simple statement of fact. The way he spoke carried the authority of someone accustomed to being in command, not the desperate bluster of someone trying to talk their way out of trouble. Inside the police station, Sergeant Williams was on the phone with the department's administrative office, trying to figure out the proper procedure for verifying federal law enforcement credentials. The FBI identification cards they had taken from David looked authentic, but Williams had never encountered anything like this situation before. "Yes, this is Sergeant Williams at the 3rd Precinct," he said into the phone. "I need to verify the identity of someone claiming to be an FBI agent. Can you walk me through the process?" While Williams was on hold, Officer Rodriguez approached his desk carrying David's wallet and identification cards. He had been examining them more carefully, and his concern was growing by the minute. "Sergeant, I think we might have a problem," Rodriguez said quietly. "I've been looking at these credentials more closely and they look extremely authentic. The holographic seals, the cardstock, even the formatting. It would be very difficult to fake something this sophisticated." Williams looked up from his phone call. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying I think this guy might actually be who he claims to be." At that moment, the administrative office came back on the line. "Sergeant Williams, I've been looking into your request. The proper procedure for verifying FBI credentials is to contact the FBI's main switchboard and ask for the Office of Professional Responsibility. They can confirm whether someone is actually an agent." Williams wrote down the phone number and immediately dialed. The phone rang twice before a professional voice answered. "FBI headquarters, how may I direct your call?" "This is Sergeant Williams with the Metro Police Department. I need to verify the identity of someone claiming to be an FBI agent. I'll transfer you to the Office of Professional Responsibility." Williams was transferred to another office, where he explained the situation to a duty officer. He provided David's name and badge number from the credentials they had confiscated. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then the FBI duty officer spoke in a voice that was suddenly much more serious and alert. "Sergeant Williams, can you repeat the name you just gave me?" "David Johnson, badge number 1847. Another pause, longer this time. Williams could hear typing in the background and what sounded like muffled conversations. "Sergeant, I'm going to need you to hold the line for just a moment." Williams was put on hold, and he could hear his own heart beating while he waited. Rodriguez was standing next to his desk, watching his expression with growing concern. After what felt like an eternity, a different voice came on the line. This one carried the unmistakable authority of someone very high up in the FBI hierarchy. "Sergeant Williams, this is Assistant Director Patricia Chen. I understand you have someone in custody claiming to be David Johnson?" "Yes, ma'am. We arrested him at his residence following reports of a break-in." "Sergeant, I need you to listen to me very carefully. David Johnson is the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He is the head of this entire organization. If you have arrested Director Johnson, this is an extremely serious situation that requires immediate resolution." Williams felt the blood drain from his face. The phone receiver suddenly felt heavy in his hand and he had to sit down in his chair to steady himself. "Ma'am, are you telling me that the man we arrested is actually the director of the FBI?" "That is exactly what I'm telling you, Sergeant. Director Johnson is one of the most recognizable law enforcement officials in the country." "Where is he now?" He's in our parking lot, still in handcuffs in the back of a patrol car." There was a moment of silence that seemed to stretch forever. "Sergeant Williams, I need you to release Director Johnson immediately and personally apologize for this mistake. This incident will need to be reported through proper channels. But right now the priority is ensuring that the director is treated with the respect his position deserves." Williams hung up the phone and looked at Rodriguez, who had been listening to the one-sided conversation with growing alarm. "We arrested the FBI director," Williams said quietly. "What? The man sitting in our parking lot in handcuffs is the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Rodriguez sat down heavily in a nearby chair. The magnitude of their mistake was beginning to sink in. They had not only arrested an innocent man at his own home, but they had arrested one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the entire country. "What do we do now?" Rodriguez asked. Williams was already grabbing his keys. "We go out there and get him out of those handcuffs right now. And then we figure out how to explain this to our captain." Outside in the parking lot, David was still sitting patiently in the back of the patrol car. Despite the humiliation and frustration of his situation, his years of experience in law enforcement had taught him that staying calm and cooperative was the best way to resolve any misunderstanding. He knew that eventually someone would verify his identity, and the truth would come out. He could see through the windows of the police station that there was suddenly a lot of activity inside. Officers were moving around more quickly, and he could see what appeared to be urgent conversations taking place. David suspected that someone had finally made the phone calls necessary to confirm who he was. Thompson was sitting in the front seat of the car, also watching the activity inside the building. His radio had been unusually quiet for the past 15 minutes, which was unusual for a busy Friday night. He was beginning to suspect that something significant was happening inside the station. Sergeant Williams and Officer Rodriguez came hurrying out of the building, walking quickly toward the patrol car. Williams looked pale and shaken, while Rodriguez appeared to be in a state of shock. David watched them approach and knew immediately that his identity had been verified. The way they were walking, the expressions on their faces, and their obvious urgency told him that someone had finally confirmed he was exactly who he claimed to be. Williams reached the car first and opened the back door. "Mr. Johnson." "Director Johnson." "Sir, I'm extremely sorry," Williams began, his voice shaking slightly. "We have verified your identity and we sincerely apologize for this mistake." As the handcuffs were removed from his wrists, David rubbed the areas where the metal had been pressing against his skin. The relief of having his hands free was immediate, but the emotional impact of what had happened would take much longer to process. "Sergeant Williams, I appreciate your apology," David said as he stepped out of the patrol car. "I understand that you and your officers were responding to what you believed was a legitimate emergency call." But even as he spoke those words, David was thinking about his wife and children at home, probably terrified and confused about what had happened to their family. The professional in him understood the mistakes that had led to this situation, but the father and husband in him was angry about the trauma this had caused his loved ones. Standing in the police station parking lot, David examined his wrists where the handcuffs had left red marks on his skin. The physical discomfort was minor compared to the emotional impact of what had just occurred, but those marks would serve as a visible reminder of this night for days to come. Sergeant Williams stood nearby, clearly struggling with how to handle the situation. In 20 years of police work, he had never encountered anything like this. Arresting the director of the FBI was the kind of mistake that could end careers and create headline news across the country. "Director Johnson, I cannot express how sorry I am about this entire situation," Williams said, his voice heavy with genuine remorse. "My officers and I were responding to what we believed were legitimate emergency calls about a break-in and possible hostage situation." David nodded slowly, his mind working through the events of the evening. His years of experience in law enforcement had taught him to analyze situations objectively, even when he was personally involved. He could see exactly how the chain of miscommunications and assumptions had led to this moment. "Sergeant, I understand that you were doing your job," David replied, "but I need to get home to my family right now. They've been through enough trauma for one evening." Williams immediately offered to have one of his officers drive David home, but David declined. He wanted to drive himself, to have those few minutes alone in his car to process what had happened and prepare for the conversation he would need to have with his wife and children. As David walked to his personal vehicle, which had been brought to the station by another officer, his phone began buzzing with missed calls and text messages. Word was already starting to spread through law enforcement channels about what had occurred. His deputy director had called 3 times. The Attorney General's office had left 2 messages, And there were several calls from numbers he didn't recognize. The drive home took 25 minutes, during which David made one phone call to his deputy director to briefly explain the situation and ask him to handle any immediate fallout. He knew that by tomorrow morning, this incident would be the subject of intense scrutiny from both law enforcement agencies and the media. When David pulled into his driveway, he could see that several neighbors were still gathered across the street, talking in small groups and occasionally glancing toward his house. The police cars were gone, but the damage to his family's privacy and sense of security had already been done. Elena opened the front door before David had even gotten out of his car. She ran to him and threw her arms around him, holding him tightly as if to make sure he was really there and really safe. "Are you okay?" she whispered, her voice still shaky from the evening's events. "I'm fine," David said, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. "How are the kids?" Scared and confused. "Amy has been crying on and off since they took you away, and Michael has been pacing around the house asking questions I don't know how to answer." Inside the house, David found his children in the living room. Amy was curled up on the couch with a blanket, her eyes red from crying. Michael was sitting nearby, still holding his phone and looking older than his 16 years. "Dad, are you really okay?" Amy asked, jumping up to hug him. "I'm okay, sweetheart," David said, holding his daughter close. It was all a big misunderstanding that got out of hand. Michael approached more cautiously. "Dad, I recorded some of what happened on my phone. Should I delete it?" David considered the question carefully. The recording could potentially be valuable evidence if there were any legal proceedings related to the incident, but it also contained images of his family during one of the most traumatic experiences of their lives. "Keep it for now," David said. "We might need it later." Elena had made tea for everyone, and they sat together in the living room while David explained what had happened at the police station. He kept the explanation simple and focused on the fact that it had all been a series of misunderstandings that started with a concerned neighbor and escalated due to poor communication. "The important thing is that everyone is safe and we're all back together," David concluded. But Amy had questions that were harder to answer. "Dad, why did they treat you that way? You're one of the good guys." David struggled to find the right words to explain something that he was still trying to understand himself. How could he explain to his teenage daughter that sometimes the system failed, even for people who worked within that system? How could he help her understand the complex issues of race, authority, and assumptions that had contributed to what happened tonight? "Sometimes people make mistakes even when they're trying to do the right thing," David said finally. "The police officers thought they were protecting our neighborhood from criminals. They didn't know who I was, and they made some wrong assumptions based on incomplete information." Elena sat quietly, listening to her husband try to explain the situation to their children. As a doctor, she was familiar with the concept of systemic failures. Situations where well-intentioned people following proper procedures still produced terrible outcomes. But experiencing it firsthand, especially when it involved her family, was something entirely different. The phone rang several times during their family discussion, but David let all the calls go to voicemail. He knew that tomorrow would bring a flood of phone calls from reporters, investigators, and government officials who would want to understand exactly what had happened. But tonight was for his family. Around midnight, Michael went upstairs to his room and Amy fell asleep on the couch. David carried his daughter to her bedroom and tucked her in, watching her peaceful face and hoping that this experience wouldn't leave lasting psychological scars. When he returned to the living room, Elena was sitting alone, staring out the window at the street where just a few hours earlier, their lives had been turned upside down. "I keep thinking about what could have happened," she said quietly. "What if one of those officers had made a different decision? What if the situation had escalated even further?" David sat beside his wife and took her hand. He knew exactly what she was thinking, because the same thoughts had been running through his mind during the drive home. Despite his position and his credentials, despite the fact that he had been completely innocent of any wrongdoing, he had been treated as a criminal suspect. And he knew that other people in similar situations, people without his resources and authority, might not have been as fortunate. "I've spent my entire career working within the law enforcement system," David said. "I've always believed that the system works, that good people doing their jobs will generally produce good outcomes. But tonight showed me that the system can fail anyone under the right circumstances. Elena squeezed his hand. What are you going to do about it? David was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. As the director of the FBI, he had the power to influence policies and procedures that could prevent similar incidents from happening to other families. But he also knew that speaking out about his own experience would thrust his family into the spotlight and potentially create political complications for his career. I don't know yet, he said honestly. I need to think about it. Outside, the neighborhood had finally returned to its normal quiet state. But David knew that for his family, nothing would ever be quite the same. The sense of security and belonging they had felt in their own home had been shattered, and rebuilding that would take time. As they prepared for bed, David noticed that Elena double-checked all the locks on the doors and windows, something she had never done before. The irony wasn't lost on him that his family now felt less safe in their own home after being protected by the police. Before turning off the lights, David stood at his bedroom window and looked out at the street. Everything appeared normal and peaceful, but he knew that tomorrow would bring challenges that would test everything he believed about justice, accountability, and the system he had devoted his life to serving. David woke up the next morning to the sound of his phone buzzing constantly on the nightstand. Even before he was fully awake, he could sense that the previous night's events had already begun to spiral beyond his control. Elena was still sleeping beside him, but he could tell from her restless movements that her sleep had been troubled. Checking his phone, David found 47 missed calls, dozens of text messages, and over 100 emails. The FBI's Media Relations Department had left 3 urgent voicemails. His deputy director had called 6 times, and there were messages from news outlets he recognized and several he didn't. The first news alert on his phone made his stomach drop. FBI director arrested at his own home in suburban Virginia. Questions raised about police conduct. Someone had leaked the story overnight. David scrolled through the early morning news coverage, finding articles on major news websites, social media posts with photos taken by neighbors, and even a brief video clip that appeared to be filmed from across the street showing police cars outside his house. Elena stirred beside him and opened her eyes. Please tell me this was all a bad dream, she said softly. David showed her his phone screen. I'm afraid it's just getting started. Downstairs, they found their children already awake and looking at their own phones. Michael had discovered that the video he recorded had somehow made its way onto social media, though he swore he hadn't posted it anywhere. Dad, my friends are texting me about seeing you on the news, Amy said, her voice small and worried. What do I tell them? Before David could answer, there was a knock at the front door. Through the window, they could see a news van parked across the street and a reporter with a cameraman standing on their front porch. We're not talking to anyone today, David said firmly. Everyone stay away from the windows. But the reporter was persistent, and soon there were more news vans arriving on their quiet street. David realized that his family was about to become the center of a media circus that could last for days, or even weeks. At FBI headquarters, Deputy Director Patricia Chen was dealing with her own crisis. The phone had been ringing nonstop since 6 a.m. with calls from congressional offices, the Attorney General, the White House, and news organizations demanding information about what had happened to Director Johnson. Chen had worked with David for 5 years and respected him both professionally and personally. She knew that he would be facing an impossible decision about how to handle this situation publicly. As the head of the FBI, anything he said would be scrutinized for political implications and could affect ongoing investigations and relationships with local law enforcement agencies across the country. At the same time, Chen understood that David had experienced something that thousands of other Americans dealt with regularly, being treated as a criminal suspect by police officers who made assumptions based on race and circumstance. His unique position gave him a platform to address these issues that most people never had. Chen's assistant knocked on her office door. Ma'am, the Attorney General is on line 1 and the White House Chief of Staff is holding on line 2. Tell them both I'll call back within the hour, Chen said. I need to talk to Director Johnson first. When Chen called David's personal cell phone, he answered on the first ring. Patricia, I assume you've seen the news coverage. It's all over every major outlet, Chen confirmed. David, I need to know how you want to handle this. The political pressure is already enormous and it's only been 12 hours. David looked out his kitchen window at the growing crowd of reporters on his street. What kind of pressure? The usual players are already choosing sides. Some people are calling for investigations into police misconduct and racial profiling. Others are saying this is being blown out of proportion, and that the officers were just doing their job. Everyone wants to know what you're going to say publicly. David had been dreading this moment since he woke up. As a private citizen, he could choose to handle this quietly and move on with his life. But as the FBI director, his experience had broader implications for law enforcement policy and community relations across the country. Patricia, in your honest opinion, what happens if I stay quiet about this? Honestly? The story probably dies down in a week or two. You avoid creating political complications for the Bureau, and life goes back to normal. And if I speak out? Chen paused before answering. That's much more complicated. You could spark important conversations about police reform and racial justice, but you'd also be criticizing local law enforcement while heading a federal law enforcement agency. It could damage relationships we've spent years building. After hanging up with Chen, David sat alone in his study, thinking about the choice he was facing. On his desk was a photo of his family from last year's vacation, all four of them smiling and carefree. He thought about Amy's tears the night before and Michael's frightened face as he watched his father being arrested. But he also thought about all the families who had experienced similar situations without the resources and authority to seek justice. How many other innocent people had been arrested in their own homes based on nothing more than suspicious neighbors and police assumptions? How many of those cases had never made the news because the victims didn't have his platform? Elena found him in his study an hour later, still staring at the family photo. Have you decided what you're going to do? She asked. I think so, David said, but I need to know how you and the kids feel about it. Whatever I decide affects all of us. Elena sat down across from him. David, I've been thinking about this all morning. Last night was the most terrifying experience of my life, but I keep thinking about other families who go through the same thing without any way to fight back. So you think I should speak out? I think you should do whatever you believe is right, and we'll figure out how to handle the consequences together. That afternoon, David called a press conference for the following day. He spent the evening writing his statement, carefully considering every word and its potential impact. He knew that once he spoke publicly about his experience, there would be no going back. The evening news coverage continued to grow, with legal experts and political commentators offering their opinions about what had happened and what it meant for police-community relations. Some defended the officers' actions as appropriate responses to emergency calls, while others condemned the entire incident as an example of systemic racism in law enforcement. David's phone rang constantly with calls from politicians, civil rights leaders, police chiefs, and other government officials. Everyone wanted to know what he was going to say and tried to influence his decision. But the call that affected him most came from Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who had made the original 911 call. Mr. Johnson, this is your neighbor from across the street, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. I am so very sorry for what happened to you and your family. I never intended for anything like this to occur. David could hear that the elderly woman was crying and his heart went out to her. Mrs. Patterson, you don't need to apologize. You saw something that concerned you and you called for help. That's what good neighbors do. But I should have known better. I should have recognized you or at least waited to see what was really happening before I called the police. Mrs. Patterson, the problem wasn't that you called the police. The problem was everything that happened after that call was made. After hanging up with his neighbor, David realized that his decision was made. Tomorrow he would tell the truth about what had happened to his family and let the consequences fall where they may. The FBI headquarters press room was packed beyond capacity the next morning. Reporters from major news networks, newspaper journalists, and representatives from civil rights organizations filled every available seat. Camera crews lined the walls, and the anticipation in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. David had spent the morning reviewing his prepared statement one final time with Elena and his children. They had decided together that this was something the family needed to do, regardless of the personal cost. Amy and Michael would not attend the press conference, but they supported their father's decision to speak publicly about their experience. As David walked to the podium, the room fell silent. He had given hundreds of press conferences during his career, but none had felt as personally important as this one. He looked out at the sea of faces and cameras, knowing that his words would be analyzed and debated for months to come. "Good morning," David began, his voice steady and professional. "2 nights ago, my family and I experienced something that thousands of American families deal with every year. We were treated as criminal suspects in our own home, based on nothing more than a neighbor's misunderstanding and a series of tragic miscommunications." He paused, looking directly into the cameras. "I want to be very clear about something from the beginning. The police officers who responded to the call about my home were doing their job as they understood it. They received reports of a possible break-in and potential hostage situation, and they responded appropriately to that information." David could see some reporters taking notes furiously, while others leaned forward in their seats, waiting for him to get to the heart of his message. However, what happened that night revealed serious problems in how we as a society handle emergency calls, assess threats, and make assumptions about people based on their appearance. My family and I are fortunate that this situation ended with nothing more than embarrassment and emotional trauma. But we all know that similar situations have ended very differently for other families. He went on to describe the events of that evening in detail, speaking candidly about the fear his children had experienced and the helplessness he had felt while handcuffed on his own front porch. He talked about the professionalism of the officers once his identity was verified, but also about the systemic issues that had allowed the situation to escalate so dramatically. "I am speaking about this today not because I want sympathy or special treatment," David continued. "I am speaking about it because my position gives me a platform that most people in similar situations don't have. And I believe that with that platform comes a responsibility to address the broader issues that this incident represents." David announced that the FBI would be launching a comprehensive review of police training programs related to implicit bias and community relations. He also called for better communication protocols between emergency dispatchers and responding officers to prevent the kind of miscommunications that had led to his arrest. "We cannot solve these problems overnight," David said, "but we can acknowledge that they exist and we can commit to doing better." The question and answer session that followed was intense and wide-ranging. Reporters asked about everything from David's personal feelings about the incident to the political implications of his public statement. He answered each question thoughtfully, refusing to be drawn into partisan debates while still addressing the substantive issues. One reporter asked whether David thought the officers should face disciplinary action. His answer surprised many people in the room. The officers involved in this incident were responding to what they believed was a dangerous emergency situation, David said. They made decisions based on the information available to them at the time. Rather than focusing on punishment, I think we should focus on prevention, better training, better communication, and better community relations. Another reporter asked about the impact on his family. David's voice became slightly emotional as he answered. "My children learned something about the world that night that I wish they never had to learn. They saw that their father, despite his position and his credentials, could be treated as a criminal suspect based on assumptions and misunderstandings. That's a harsh lesson for any child to learn." The press conference lasted for over an hour, and by the time it ended, David knew that his life and career had changed permanently. He had crossed a line from which there was no return, speaking publicly about issues that many in law enforcement preferred to handle quietly. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Civil rights leaders praised David for using his position to address systemic problems in policing. Some law enforcement officials criticized him for undermining police authority and damaging relationships between federal and local agencies. Politicians from both parties tried to use his statement to support their own agendas, but the most meaningful responses came from ordinary people who had experienced similar situations. David's office received hundreds of letters and emails from families who shared their own stories of being treated as suspects in their own neighborhoods. Many of them thanked him for giving voice to experiences that had been ignored or dismissed by the broader society. Over the following months, David worked with community leaders, civil rights organizations, and law enforcement agencies to develop new training programs and policies. The changes were gradual and sometimes met with resistance, but progress was being made. The impact on his family was more complex. Elena returned to her work at the hospital, where she found that some colleagues treated her differently, some with sympathy, others with a kind of awkward curiosity about her experience. Amy and Michael had to deal with classmates and teachers who recognized them from news coverage, and both children required counseling to process the trauma of that night. But there were positive changes as well. The family grew closer together, united by their shared experience and their decision to speak out about it. They received support from unexpected places, neighbors who apologized for not understanding their situation, colleagues who shared their own stories of discrimination, and community members who expressed gratitude for their courage. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who had made the original 911 call, became an unlikely ally in David's efforts to improve community relations. She began speaking at community meetings about the importance of knowing your neighbors and the dangers of making assumptions based on race or appearance. 6 months after the incident, David stood in the same community center where he now regularly attended neighborhood meetings. The room was filled with a diverse group of residents, police officers, and community leaders who met monthly to discuss ways to improve relationships and prevent misunderstandings. "Change is hard," David said to the group. "It requires us to examine our assumptions, acknowledge our mistakes, and commit to doing better. But the alternative, continuing to allow fear and misunderstanding to divide us, is much worse." A young police officer in the audience raised his hand. "Director Johnson, what would you want officers like me to take away from your experience?" David thought for a moment before answering. "I would want you to remember that everyone you encounter during your job is someone's father or mother, son or daughter. They have families who love them and depend on them. And I would want you to remember that how you treat people during what might be the worst moment of their lives will stay with them forever." As David drove home that evening, he reflected on how much had changed since that night when he couldn't get his key to work in his own front door. The incident had cost him some relationships and created new challenges in his career. But it had also opened his eyes to experiences that he had known about intellectually, but never understood personally. Most importantly, it had given him and his family a sense of purpose that went beyond their individual lives. They had turned their trauma into action, their pain into progress, and their fear into hope for a better future. The house on Elm Street looked the same as it had before that fateful evening, but the family that lived there had been forever changed. They were stronger, more aware, and more committed to creating a world where no family would have to experience what they had gone through. And every evening when David came home from work, he was reminded of that night by the new porch light that now illuminated their front door, a small but meaningful symbol of the changes that can come from even the darkest moments.